from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Over the past several years, it's been our privilege on this program to address a number of women's issues and women's organizations. Most prominent was the international conference held here dealing with empowering women. It is now our opportunity on this program to look at this from a perspective of men and an organization that's located in Spokane, Washington. It is a nonprofit organization, and we're very pleased to welcome 3 members of an organization called In Men. I would like to welcome to the program, first of all, to my immediate left is Al Turtle, who is serving as the president of In Men. Next to him is Richard Dahlke, who is the editor of the In Men newsletter. And the third guest today is Ben Camp, who is a member of the organization. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. And I know because of our discussions prior to the program that you have some most interesting things to talk about as men's interrelationships, not only with men but also women, and how that may be somewhat different from some of the subjects that we've discussed in relation to women's organizations. And thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Well, thank you.
And I'm always pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho. And I shall ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
As Tony mentioned, this is a very interesting subject, and we had a good conversation before the show, and we want to get right on to the heart of what we're going to talk about, but we do need to know a little bit about your organization first. So, Al, can you tell us what you are and what you do?
Well, this organization was put together about 4 years ago in November of '91, and the name In Men, Inland Northwest Men's Involvement Network. There are several men's involvement networks in the country. And the idea is that a group of men getting together to promote and to at least draw attention to men's positions, to the support of men as a really viable member of the community, not from the point of view as men as in power, but as men as a joining with women. So we often find that the voice of men is left out, and so we're kind of coming together, I think, because we'd like to voice that opinion.
And one of the things that you do, as I understand it, is that you're sort of a network. Ben, can you talk about how you view the organization as a member? What kinds of things does the organization do?
Well, we've been involved in a number of different projects, whether it's a resource directory that we put out for a variety of agencies on what's available for men. We put on a series of workshops for men in divorce with attorneys and lawyers and judges and domestic violence kind of issues, men in anger. We've sponsored a number of key speakers coming to towns in the past. So as well as list a number of the different men or the men's support groups that are available both in northern Idaho and in Spokane area, so that people know where to go and where to find men's groups in the different areas. So it's a variety of things. Every year we're looking at what do we want to do different in next year.
And Richard, you're the editor of the newsletter.
Yes.
And so how often does that come out, and what does that do?
That's been coming out every other month for the last 3.5 years or so, and basically it's an opportunity for us to give out information, disseminate information to men in the community and women in the community about our activities. We have the list of the men's group in there. We have a list of public kinds of things that might be of interest to men as far as public agencies that men might want to go to if they're going through a divorce or if they've had some maybe sexual abuse in their past and they want to know what kind of group they can go to or whatever. Along with that, we also have every month or every issue a snapshot of someone in the community, typically a therapist or someone that might be working with men. And we also list all the different kinds of, like this particular issue, one of our latest issues had a picture of Robert Bly and John Lee, some of our speakers that we're bringing into town. We have those kinds of things on there also. And usually it's about 24 pages, and we have several hundred people on our mailing list in the Spokane, Coeur d'Alene area.
We want to get to some heart of some of the issues, and Janelle did a great job helping our viewers understand what your organization is. My first question has to do with a compare and contrast between the rearing of young women and young men. And we know that whether we're involved in any kind of organization or not, how men and how women react to a lot of issues, and on a personal relationship basis, very different. Al, I guess I'll start with you and give us some your insights. And I should tell our viewers that all of you are therapists, and so that adds some professional aspects to this. What makes men and women look at relationships different because of their environment and upbringing?
It made me think of kind of almost two little very brief stories. The first one I recall from my own life, when I was about 5, I remember looking out at my family, and I was very concerned about who was taking care of whom. And I realized that my older brother and older sister helped take care of me, and my mother took care of us 3, and my father took care of my mother, and then suddenly I was aware who took care of Dad. And it brought a sense of chill to me that I was going to have to grow up to be a dad, and no one took care of me. It was a really frightening thing. I've seen the same thing happening again in the teenage mode, where I see young men who at age 12, 13 begin to take courses in school that will lead them directly into some high-paying job, because they know they have to survive. They know they have to be responsible. And you often find, comparatively, women at that age often find it, who are still taking courses that they enjoy but aren't necessarily going to lead to a high-paying job. I think there's a basic postural difference in the way we're bringing up young men still today, even though some of that's changing.
And Ben, before the show, you were certainly articulating well this question about bonding between children and their parents, or how both young boys and young girls bond with their mother, and the father's often at work and absent. Would you explain how that affects the outcome?
Well, I was looking at the fact that we have basic tasks of bonding with mother, then separating with mother, bonding with father, and separating from father. Those are certain developmental tasks we must go through. We all tend to bond with mother pretty well. That's immediate. I think for most boys, and maybe girls for that matter too, but for most boys, separating from mom becomes a problem. Well, as we grow older, a lot of the men want to try to figure out how to separate from dad. Well, they never bonded with dad. Dad typically wasn't there. He was either out working, or he was on the road, or he was emotionally unavailable, so that bonding never took place. And so it seems to be different tasks that we must accomplish between our fathers and our mothers. Again, how we were raised, I think of my daughter playing library with a friend, and I'm sitting there watching thinking, well, how do you win? And there's no winning in this game, library. They take turns, they talk, the whole game is centered around them communicating. Growing up, and what I did was play baseball, softball, football, whatever it took, but we didn't talk about and share, we competed. And so there's a whole different mode in which we are trained, which I still see going on, because my daughter is still young.
And Richard, I'd follow up on that with a question to you, and that is that not only during the period of adolescence that Ben's talking about, but in adulthood, do women within networks and so forth communicate better and be more supportive than men? Would you explain how you perceive the difference in communication between the sexes?
I think there's probably quite a bit of difference. I'm thinking of Tannen's book, You Just Don't Understand, how men have a tendency to what she calls report talk, and women rapport talk. And rapport is about understanding each other and wanting to communicate a way and listen in a way where you really understand the person that's communicating to you. And men have a way of, if you ask them, well, how'd your day go or what happened, they start sort of reporting, well, this and this and this and this, and they go down the list. And typically, and as a therapist, I see this with my clients a lot, and in the groups that I do, that men are typically very poor listeners. And usually what happens in their brain is they're thinking about their next question in their mind rather than in listening to the person that's talking. And I think women are typically much better listeners. And as a therapist, I've sort of had to learn to train myself. I grew up in a family of 12 children, 10 boys and 2 girls. And by and large, we were not very good communicators, any of us. And the boys were always competitive, like Ben had said. And the girls were learning more how to be nurturing to each other. And so I think as grown-ups, lots of times in our family and in other families that I see and as clients I see, men are still competitive, side by side, trying to one-up each other, and women more naturally are trying to listen, be empathetic and understanding, and really listen to the person that they're talking to. So.
Can I add a thought to that? Because there's a great growth of, along with Deborah Tannen's work, with John Gray's work, on Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, that allows us to kind of talk as a community about these differences between men and women. And one of the experiences that I have with my wife is that I come from Venus to some extent. She comes from Mars. We have a hard time reading that book because I tend to talk to connect. That's the way I was brought up. I was brought up by a pediatrician, a father. By the way, as therapists, we're all nurturers. That's our profession. It's a nurturing profession. And so in talking to my wife, I tend to come out in a way to connect with her, and she comes back from a competing mode. That was the very male-oriented home she came from. So the only point I want to make is that while we often say men are like this, women are like this, that when you deal with a couple, and I certainly deal with plenty of couples, you don't know until they come into the office who's who.
That's an important point to make. It's not always the stereotype.
Right. Not at all.
It may be more masculine and feminine ways of communicating, and other. If we had to put a gender to it, but it's really just different modes of intimacy, and that it is important that we learn that there is more than one mode, and if we're going to communicate, we need to learn each other's modes. And once we approach it that way, once couples approach it that way, it opens up this idea that just because, and mostly women will be able to articulate their mode, and men will look at you and not know that they even have one, much less how to articulate it. And it's important to help draw that out, to say, well, men do have a mode of intimacy, it's just different.
And it changes relationships drastically when you can
Once
do that.
you can approach each other as equal partners with different modes that you both have a responsibility to learn in order to meet each other halfway. Now, it is important that men learn women's mode of intimacy, but it's also important that men learn their own, and then also that they're able to communicate that to women. A lot of women are just asking, what do you want? And men go, I don't know. Well, I think it's our job to articulate what we want.
Janelle Berg.
One of the workshops that you've had within the last few years has been one on divorce and what is the effect of divorce on men. We talked a little bit about that before the show, and it was very interesting. So let's just start and go right down the line here. And each one of you feel free to interject as we go along. Al, what were some of the things that you learned from that particular conference, and what does divorce mean to men?
Oh, I think that particularly first divorce is a shattering event for a man. I think there's a whole set of dreams and expectations, which is true also for women that they lose, but for men, that underground nurturing system that they've been getting from their partner suddenly is gone. And I think I have gone through a divorce even some years ago, 15 years ago, and it just devastated me for quite a long time. And I had nothing to fall back on. And as we know, men tend to commit suicide very rapidly in that situation. I certainly thought of it at the time, because we don't tend to make a support community. It's very hard for men to say, help, and ask that from someone you're going to compete with. So to me, divorce is really shattering. And in my office in the last 2 days, I've had people come in who are saying, help, I've just found out my wife's leaving me. You know, it's a very shattering event for men.
Yeah, devastating is the word that came to my mind. And the reason is that I really want to emphasize and agree with what Al was saying, is that typically women's best friends are other women, and men's best friends are also women. And so their support group, that's their only support group, is their wife typically. And so when there's a divorce, it's like there's no one there. There's no net underneath them to catch them when they fall. And the one advantage I can see from men getting divorced is that that's typically when they approach organizations like ours or therapists or someone, and finally they're willing to say and be vulnerable enough to say, I need some help, I need to do something different, this isn't working, I need some support, and then begin seeking it and come to like retreats or workshops or whatever that we have to offer. So.
And this is often when men lose their children too, as well, if they're younger. They may be the person who moves out of the family home.
Right.
Probably more often, is that?
Yes. Definitely.
And I think that's a good point, because so often we think about typically we hear the deadbeat dad. That seems to be the term we hear a lot about. And I think one of the things that we find, though, is that as I am separated not only from the emotional caretaker in the relationship, the woman was responsible for her emotions and mine, but that also what ends up happening is I am now separated from the kids, I may have been seen, if, speaking in terms of myself as a man, as distant, but it's like in most men I deal with, and in my own life, I saw myself, rightfully or wrongly, it's like as doing all these things I did for the family, working 12 hours a day, 2 jobs, 7 days a week for them. Now, if you ask them what they wanted, it wasn't that me and the rest of the men were out of the house all the time, but it was in that image of doing for. Again, I'm not saying that's always true, but in terms of how men see it, then all of a sudden everything they've been doing for is gone. And what you'll find is that they won't know who to do it for now, because they haven't thought of doing it for themselves. And so life becomes hopeless in a hurry, because my meaning has been withdrawn. My meaning for doing all this stuff is gone. And then that's when the suicide rate, and the suicide rate among men, there was one study that I think since men and women are girls and boys around 8 years old is the last time that the suicide rate is equal. By the time a male gets to be like 76 years old, their suicide rate is 1,300 times that of women of the same age. And it just multiplies every year from 8 to 76. So there is no comparison between male and female suicides.
We talked a little bit about, before the show, about why men are perhaps more successful at suicide. Does someone want to talk about that?
Yeah, the statistics I've read is that women actually attempt suicide more often, but men are more successful, typically because they use more drastic and lethal weapons, like guns or jump off bridges or whatever. I suppose part of that is because men being goal-oriented and wanting to succeed at whatever they do, they also are successful at ending their own life. And I know Paul Quinnett in Spokane has written a book about suicide, a real successful one, and he's doing some workshops, I think, around the area. And he has all kinds of statistics about sort of the sadness. And one thing I was thinking about when Ben was talking is that men not only lose their meaning when they go through a divorce and they tend towards suicide, is they sort of lose their appreciation. And what I mean by that is that lots of times when I see clients, like children of men that have gone through a divorce, is they see it in a totally different picture. The children see, well, I don't see it that you were working hard and doing all this stuff for us. All I saw is that you were gone all the time, and that you weren't there, and you abandoned us. And they see it from a negative perspective when the man is trying to do everything that he can possibly do in his mind, but he's not understanding the other perspective of how that looks like from the children's perspective. And so, like, all of a sudden, I'm not even being appreciated for what I did do on top of everything else. And so that really adds too.
I don't want to clarify something. I mean, as I'm listening to us talk, it's like I can just hear people saying, "Hey, poor men." I mean, that's. And I want to nip that one, because I think one of the biggest issues for men is that we have to get out of that role anyway. I think a lot of men that I've talked to have that sense of it's not fair, people are trying to mess me over, my wife is out to get me, the kids don't appreciate. I mean, I have no sympathy or tolerance for a lot of that, poor me. But I think one of the things that it's important is that is because men, we're not very good at sharing emotions and dealing with things, and claiming what we need to claim for ourselves, speaking about what we need to speak for, asking for help, and saying what we want, is that we couldn't do it to ourselves. I mean, without beating myself up, but saying, hey, I'm responsible for learning to do these things. I'm responsible for taking care of myself. I can't take care of others if I'm not taking care of me, and that's my responsibility. But in the past, we've always looked to women to do that for us. I think the biggest thing that I have found, the most positive aspect of what is called men's movement, is that finally men are looking to each other and saying help, and we're learning to start getting the answers from each other versus always making the women of our lives responsible for our whole emotional beings, which was never fair to them, but most importantly, never fair to us.
Al, can I follow up on what Ben has said? He, in his answer, made the comment that men are much more difficult at expressing their emotions, at least in public. A candidate for office, for example, if it's a man and he cries in public, his defeat may be assured. Not always, but again, we've set certain cultural values in how we anticipate men and women are going to behave. And so I say all that to get this question. Since men have more difficult time with the expressing and letting go of certain emotions, how does that affect particularly the emotion of anger? How do men deal with anger compared with women?
Well, I think I teach a lot. Working in this business, you have to spend time with a man and teach him about emotions. And the only way you can get at him usually is into his head, because that's about the only place we start, is in our heads. We've learned to get away from our feelings and get up here into our heads. So you have to start teaching them about anger. I think that what we usually talk about in the media is that you see a man exploding, and you see him exploding in some sort of destructive pattern. And that does not necessarily mean that when that man's through with that he expressed any anger. He just caused a lot of trouble. And I end up teaching a lot about how to be in touch with that feeling of anger so that you can get it out. You know, the simple anger management says go out and walk, you know, for a while. Do something to discharge that build-up energy. But our culture says keep quiet, hold in, don't move. The whole culture is saying that. And most of those emotions, anger and grief, and for that matter, joy, are expressive emotions, and the culture is saying don't do it. So you end up with a lot of people bottled up, men in particular, and men, I was thinking of the other piece there is men, by the way, I think are often successful at suicide because we're trained to be killers. You know, we start off life as we are the bodyguards of the women. We're supposed to go out there and go to war. So we're good at killing, and the little boys are thinking about guns and weapons. I think that contributes to why they're successful at killing themselves. That's kind of a sad thought, but there it is. So here they are not taught how to express emotions, particularly anger, appropriately. And so what they do is they burst out in some way that when they're done with it, they're worse off than they started off in the first place. And so as a culture, we need to have some role models out there teaching people how to get angry and not cause trouble, how to be angry appropriately, or how to cry without it causing trouble. I think we're beginning to see that in movies, but mostly in public we're still kind of saying, control it, control it.
And another part of anger that lots of times some people will teach, and some disagree with this and some agree with it, is that lots of times that word appropriate is really important, because lots of times there's something underneath anger, other feelings, sometimes grief, sadness, loneliness, pain, inadequacy, that are real difficult for most of us men. I know those are hard emotions for me to feel, much less express. And that sometimes if I'm able to express those feelings, then it's easy for me not to be as angry. But lots of times I think of anger as sort of like trying to play an organ where you have all these keys out here, but only one pipe works. And so all the music's trying to come out one pipe, and that's rage. And so that no matter what subtleties you might be trying to have your emotions come out as, it comes out just one different kind of information, and that's rage or anger. And so men don't have very much opportunity, and so they got to learn how to open up all the different expressions that they have.
Before we go out to Janelle, I want to get back another series with her. Ben, one final question that relates to another emotion, that is fear. Also in our society, women and men are taught to handle fear very differently. How does that play on this whole problem?
Well, I think it's not okay for me to be afraid. I mean, that's obvious. I mean, if I'm going to be afraid, it's going to be, in war, and then it's okay. But as long as you say, yeah, I feel it, but we're not going to let it bother me. I mean, it's like when we talk about it's okay, but you can't be okay. I think, though, that to me, a lot of men I talked to, and I remember in my own life, the most thing I was frightened of was when my wife would look at me and say, we need to talk. And that was when my fear went right up the ceiling, because that is something that I had no concept of. Tell me to go out there and fight the fire, or go out there and, fight the battle and go to war, and I'm not nearly as afraid. And so we think about fear differently. Typically, I mean, Al talked about, we were trained as the defenders. Well, we are the disposable sex, or the gender, rather. I mean, in war, and innocent women and children, we don't hear innocent men spoken of, and lifeboats over the edge of the ship, men go down with the ship, women and children are innocent, they get to escape. I mean, the message is loud and clear since I can remember that I am dispensable, but that women and children aren't. So once I stop, which is why most men maybe don't want to grow up, it's like, as long as I stay a child, I'm okay, but the minute I become a man, I'm disposable.
Janelle Berg.
I want to give you first an opportunity, Al, to tell people who might be listening where they could get in touch with this organization, because I think there are going to be some men out there who would like to know how could they get into some kind of touch with their feelings.
Oh, my goodness gracious. What's our phone number?
Do you have a phone number?
Yes, we have a phone number and an address. The phone number is area code 509-624-1436, and the address is Post Office Box 132, Spokane, Washington, 99210.
I can just hear some viewers saying, I didn't get that. I'll give the number again, and then of course they can always contact this program itself at North Idaho College, which they do from time to time, but your telephone number is area code 509-624-1436.
Yes, that's correct.
Continue, Janelle.
Now, one of the questions, too, that I have has to do with violence. That's a part of anger, of course, but violence toward each other. And who would like to talk about that?
I'll just say a little tiny bit about that, and what makes me think about that is sort of a background behind it. Robert Bly's writing a new book called The Sibling Society, and it talks about all of us sort of growing up without very many mentors or very much wisdom from other men coming down, showing us how to be adult males and knowing how to express our feelings and know how to really be helpful parts of the community in helpful and constructive ways. And when boys grow up not learning those kinds of things, what they turn to is trying to raise each other, and so they join gangs, or this happened in my own family actually with 10 boys. We all sort of tried to parent each other, but we didn't know how to do it very well. And so an awful lot of violence and anger, I think, comes from that, of not knowing, of sort of seeking out in the traditions in some of the African countries. Their saying is, I'm not sure exactly how they say this, but it's something along the lines of that the old men's job, the wise men's job, is sort of contain the space so that the young men can sort of have their fire and get it all out, but the older men will say, okay, that's enough, or here's how to guide that in a certain direction. We don't have that in our community very well, I don't think. We don't have that place of, here's how you direct that energy in positive and constructive ways. We don't have that mentor, that wisdom.
Although there's lots of attention on men's violence toward women, what is the violence toward each other?
Well, that's what I was saying earlier, is that, I mean, and I'm not trying to by any means discount the point of men's violence towards women. That's a critical issue. I mean, we are more powerful, stronger physically. But yet at the same time, I think we have, that women are somehow allowed in a relationship to express anger, and they have both permission in themselves to express anger, whereas men tend to bottle it until they explode. I think
I'm going to have to interrupt. We got the signal. We're out of time.
Okay.
I'm sorry we're leaving the viewers hanging like that, but we'll try to have you back at some other time. Ladies and gentlemen, our three guests are from InMen in Spokane, and we've been discussing men and men's issues and how that also relates to women. I'm sure you found this program very informative, and I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we will discuss yet another important issue on this program. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.